Welcome everyone to the Civics Project. I'm Beth Roubaix, the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this 27th episode on Puerto Rico, featuring our very special guest, Nicole Hernandez. Before we begin today, I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tobangar, the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. And as noted, today we're focusing on the subject of Puerto Rico, which in a podcast that focuses on US government and politics is an urgent subject because Puerto Rico remains one of a number of colonized nations which are under the political and legal and military dominance and authority of the US government. So I was really delighted today to be able to include a guest who represents Puerto Ricans in Action, which is one of my favorite Los Angeles-based organizations and really represents a continual and powerful demonstration that community organizing is powerful and that talking back to mainstream politics is essential, and that just, people with goodwill and intelligence and clarity about the political forces we're fighting can do amazing things. And I'm especially delighted to welcome Nicole Hernandez, who is, this is the first time she's accepted an invitation to speak with Repair, though we've issued a few in past. And I know her to be a very insightful and lovely and thoughtful and historically conscious person. So I'm just extra thrilled to have her joining us. Nicole is a first-year doctoral student in the sociocultural anthropology program at Arizona State University. We already miss her here in Los Angeles. And she completed her master's in visual anthropology and her bachelor's in cultural anthropology at the University of Southern California. In 2016, Nicole co-founded Puerto Ricans in Action, Los Angeles, in response to the imposition of a fiscal oversight board in Puerto Rico by Congress and then President Obama. Puerto Ricans in Action has held numerous rallies and educational events around LA County. After Hurricane Maria, Puerto Ricans in Action raised over $100,000 to execute initiatives such as distributing more than 30,000 water filters through local health care providers to residents without access to clean water. So Nicole, welcome. As noted, really, really honored and delighted to have you here with us and to have the chance to help share your insights with our audience. And I wanted to start by asking you about the legal and political status of Puerto Rico. We know that according to the US government, Puerto Rico is a US territory. What does that mean? And how did Puerto Rico wind up in this relationship to the United States?
Well, thank you. Yes, let's kick that off. So I'd say that Puerto Rico is a classic definition of a colony. So it's it is a non-governing, non-self-governing nation. It was acquired to be a colony. It was meant to stay a colony. And there's legal precedents with this in the Supreme Court case, insular cases that dictates that Puerto Rico is part of the U.S., but belongs to the U.S., but not part of the U.S. It is foreign in a domestic sense. So the issue of, I think, Puerto Rico's colony is a human rights issue. It's not in compliance with international law. And it dates back to, prior to obviously U.S. Invading Puerto Rico in 1898, it was a Spanish colony since the early 1500s. So colonialism is very embedded in basically our culture. But the U.S., does invade in 1898 through the southern part of Puerto Rico in Guanica, and quickly just takes over the island, controls most of its land, devalues its currency by 40% and causes a huge debt crisis. And an equivalent of what Hurricane Maria did in 2017 happens with the hurricane then. And the response is just, let's depopulate the island. And that's the kind of the goal ever since, is just to continually depopulate. Puerto Rico isn't, like you mentioned, the only colony. The US captures Guam, the Philippines during the same period. So at the moment of the beginning of this colonization, the island's economy gets destroyed. At the time, there was coffee, sugarcane, tobacco, lots of fresh produce. And now, again, with Hurricane Maria, we see after a couple weeks or so, just very quickly, rapidly, the ability to be self-sustainable is impossible in Puerto Rico without, continuous dependency on the US. And so the dilemma, I think, early upon kind of acquiring that Puerto Rico, and it's an archipelago. So there's, I think, 7 islands in total. It's Puerto Rico being sort of the biggest, but there's also Vieques and Andres, and Vieques, Culebra, Mona, Isla de, I'm forgetting the other ones, a couple more that I visited and will become important in this conversation. But I think the central question is if the Constitution follows the flag, and the answer is no. And the insular cases create a new set of terms to oversee the territories as incorporated or unincorporated. And
can I ask you, what are the insular cases? Not all of our audience members will know.
So they're a series of decisions. I can look up the exact dates, but they're the Supreme Court cases, a series of cases that are dealing with the issue of these acquired new territories that are of people of basically of an alien race. So we're different, culture, we're a different race, different ethnicity, and so distinctly so that it would be impossible to integrate into the US. And so therefore the Constitution does not apply in these places.
So people in Puerto Rico don't have rights under the Constitution?
So in 1917, Puerto Rico is given, US citizenship is then imposed upon Puerto Ricans. Mm-hmm. And that provides sort of a mix of access to certain rights and federal programs, but not all. And those just fluctuate over the years. And even currently, there's issues with like SSI that were being decided upon right now in sort of federal courts and the Justice Department. And so Puerto Rico is being classified as an unincorporated territory, unlike maybe Oklahoma or New Mexico or Alaska, which were imagined to be on this path of statehood. Puerto Rico is never intended to be. And we are given, again, with citizenship, we have US passports, which is a really big thing for a lot of people. And the citizenship is a critical part of the divide of a lot of, for Puerto Ricans, feelings on what the political future status should be. But again, it doesn't give all the rights US citizens enjoy, such as they don't vote for a president. There's no vote. There's no voting member in Congress. There is a non-voting resident commissioner in Congress, and that's the extent of it. But Puerto Ricans pay into Social Security taxes, into Medicare, without full coverage, for instance, of Medicare reimbursement. And in a lot of cases, individuals, and for a number of individuals, they actually do pay federal taxes, even though it's not across the board true of everybody. But there's import-export taxes, and sales tax is probably the highest out of the 50 US states. So the argument, there's been a lot of court cases to try to address some of these discriminatory and really, the issues. And the debate falls, the argument is that this is not discriminatory of a people, but of a place and a space. So this is how, I guess, it's circumvented, but who disproportionately lives in Puerto Rico is Puerto Rican. So there's been many bills introduced to Congress to resolve the political issue, and there's two, and we could talk about two current bills in Congress, but so there's not progress been made.
So what I'm hearing is that our courts are saying, oh, it's not racism because it's against a country?
Against a place. Yeah.
A place. That's interesting and troubling. Okay. So what I'm also hearing, let me see if I've understood well, because I know the landscape is really complicated. But basically what we're saying is it goes generations back, that Puerto Rico was colonized by the US military, and that it was never, unlike Alaska or potentially Hawaii or Oklahoma, intended to become a state, and that people in Puerto Rico have US citizenship, but don't have all the rights that people in the United States have. Did I get all that correct?
Right. And, for instance, yes, you did get all that correct. And one of the cases where we should have full, equal rights or equal support, was where we didn't was after, again, Hurricane Maria in 2017, where FEMA is supposed to, respond in an equal manner in Puerto Rico as anywhere else, and that was not the case at all. And so one of the arguments is, would statehood actually give us a better response in a moment of disaster, a hurricane in the future from FEMA or not? And obviously not, it's very divided, people's opinion on that.
Yeah, I can imagine there'd be a lot of resistance to just becoming a US state rather than Puerto Rico sort of regaining independence as its own nation.
Correct.
So before we move into more of the politics and history, tell us more about Puerto Ricans in Action and what the organization does, what brought it into being, what it's like to organize with the folks within it.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the beginning, 2016, there was a spontaneous rally that myself and a few others organized in downtown LA. And from that group, we collectively decided there was a gap in our extended Puerto Rican community in Los Angeles for events and educational information, things that to reconnect Puerto Ricans in Los Angeles and to Puerto Rico. We were missing that, and we felt like our culture was invisible in Los Angeles, and we could do a lot here. And I think we did over the past 5 or 6 years. We tried to really become a central organizer for Puerto Ricans and traveled throughout LA County, out to San Bernardino, in Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange County, to organize. And we hosted speakers such as Oscar Lopez Rivera, which is our former political prisoner, and basically freedom fighter for Puerto Rican independence. And then we hosted multiple book tours and film screenings and collaborated across the state with similar groups in Oakland and San Diego. And through that process, when it came time to really respond after Hurricane Maria, and then in 2020, there was an intense swarm of earthquakes that struck the southern coastline. We were also kind of able to activate a network of really hundreds of Puerto Ricans across Southern California to respond by, fundraising both money, but supplies that we were able to ship back out to Puerto Rico after the hurricane and again after the earthquakes, and then be able to have solidarity rallies and marches. In Hollywood, we held one where maybe 1,000 people really came out, and we marched, kind of took over Hollywood Boulevard, had speakers, and that was it was really impressive for everybody to see the support. It had people fly out from Texas even, because there was just nothing happening in their neighborhood. And then again, sort of this all revitalized after, during the summer of 2019, when there was massive protests in Puerto Rico that enforced its then now disgraced governor to resign. And so that's kind of Puerto Ricans action in a nutshell. And right now we're kind of on a hiatus. It's like myself and a lot of others have left Los Angeles. So we're trying to figure out how to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's quite the nutshell. Thank you. What does it mean for Puerto Ricans to be colonized today? What is that reality, and how does it affect families, communities? It's a hard question, I know.
Definitely. So I think one of the biggest, I'd say, challenges for Puerto Rico is actually the accumulation of challenges and the inability really to pull things out of that. And so, the inability, we know that, for instance, reports came out after the fact that after Hurricane Maria, the Trump administration really deterred aid from getting released. And so that delayed repairs for 2 or 3 years. And people, we talk about the need to recover from the hurricane, but if you go back 30, 50 years, you see a lot of troubling things in the landscape going back decades. So I think the inability to coherently package all these problems into a single issue that can be resolved because of how complicated it is, and is the biggest challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges for still being a colonized nation, and the division amongst families and the depopulation because of the continuous austerity measures that this Fiscal Control Board is imposing means more and more younger people continue to leave, and it's changing the demographics of the island, and the burdens placed on future generations, we know now because of how the debt restructuring is occurring through this Oversight Management Board, is going to put a burden on like the next 40, 50 years of the following generations to repay Wall Street vulture funds, to the deterioration of, again, just the continuous declining, cultural infrastructures, from schools, from healthcare to roads. And it's hard to kind of tell going around, Puerto Rico, what is a result of maybe the hurricane versus the earthquakes versus just the debt crisis at this point with the conditions of infrastructure. And it also means that privatization is what's being pursued and imposed by, again, the Fiscal Control Board, who hasn't been elected. It wasn't intended to legislate, but inadvertently does. And so, I think after the hurricane, there was a huge depopulation, but that wasn't the first moment in time where that's happened. And going back, there was almost equivalent number of individuals left during the 50s and 60s, for example, when there was a whole economic development plan that was instituted. And so that's how I think a lot of our generations connect themselves to these similar circumstances of kind of economic exile.
Mm-hmm. So just to break this down for our audience who are totally new to the issue, the fiscal control or fiscal oversight, what that sounds like to me is the US government basically exerting direct control or influence in the Puerto Rican economy. Is that about right?
It is. So it's a board of 7, 9 people who are appointed by Congress.
By the U.S. Congress.
By the U.S. Congress. And
so president.
Yeah, I think each party gets to nominate, and then a couple have to be from Puerto Rico, but the majority are not. Mm-hmm. And Puerto Rico, no matter what its constitution says or doesn't say, the U.S. Congress is, the U.S. Constitution supersedes it, and Congress, as long as Puerto Rico doesn't butt up against Congress in any way, then it's okay. But as soon as it does, then Congress steps in, or a federal agency steps in and supersedes local decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
So this board that was created by the U.S. Congress is exerting a lot of control in the Puerto Rican economy. And one of the consequences you mentioned is that a lot of people are having to leave Puerto Rico. Is that because there's not enough economic opportunity?
There is. So I think there's an intentional austerity that's, it's not that there's not opportunity. There's opportunity plenty for Wall Street to make money there. There's plenty for international investors to come and take advantage, and industry to come and take advantage of tax incentives, and people investing. Just any person can invest in municipal bonds there. You get triple tax exempt. There's plenty of opportunity to make money for basically nobody, mostly for people who don't live in Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And so there is a lot of initiatives. There's a few initiatives to encourage people to, young people to rematriate, to start rebuilding local economies, and especially going towards sustainable energy models. There's kind of hyper local communities doing really great work. And I know a number of people who have gone back to support these initiatives. Yeah, but the lack of, it could be, work opportunities it's a very big reason mm-hmm. everybody goes. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one powerful answer, that the U.S. is exerting a lot of control over the economy, and it's chasing a lot of young Puerto Ricans out.
And in terms of the economy, again, like Puerto Rico is considered a captive market. So there is from the 20s, an act, the Merchant Marine Act, the Jones Act, referred to it as, imposes a requirement that anything imported to Puerto Rico come on U.S. made ships. And a couple other, I think Alaska, Hawaii have this issue. But in Puerto Rico, this means that cost for everything, again, increases. And after the hurricane became a huge problem because we weren't able to bring in or allow neighboring countries to send aid in as quickly as they were willing to do so. And there was a short, 10-day waiver of the Jones Act. And also going back to the opportunity, and the opportunity for corporations versus a local, maybe small business owner or something, but Puerto Rico has the highest number of big franchises. So whether it's Walmart, Walgreens, Baskin Robbins, Puerto Rico had some of the highest producing franchises for U.S. corporations are there, and so much so that Puerto Rico easily, pays back to the U.S. through these corporations than what they're receiving from, reimbursements or Social Security or federal programming. So the highest grossing, the CEO of a Baskin Robbins went to Puerto Rico to visit one of the stores that was literally the highest grossing Baskin Robbins in the U.S. In this one town in Puerto Rico. Yeah.
Wow. So how is the United Nations thinking about or relating to or acknowledging the colonization of Puerto Rico?
So the United Nations, Puerto Ricans actively attend the Special Committee on Decolonization at the United Nations, and a lot of individuals testify. And I think it was around 1970, 72, where they started recognizing Puerto Rico was not really self-governing, as the US had argued in the 50s to remove it from the list of colonies, where such as Guam is still on that list, or Samoa, I think, is on that list, but Puerto Rico is not. And the US, I think, just prevents any sort of resolution from making it to the US, to the General Assembly in the UN to actually have a full discussion and see, try to get Puerto Rico back on that list and have that recognition.
Mm.
But it's a domestic issue apparently. So.
Mm. So the United States is not fully recognizing, or is only partially recognizing Puerto Rico as colonized. Okay.
Yeah, the United States recognizes Puerto Rico as a commonwealth, not a colony.
That's an interesting semantic, the distinction between a commonwealth and a colony. I'm always curious about what that actually means, but.
And in Spanish, it's a free association. It's referred to as asociado libre
It's a free association, even if it was achieved by military force, though. That's also an interesting designation.
Supposedly, when Puerto Rico voted for its first governor in the 50s, and they created its local constitution, like these were all metrics that the US held up as evidence that Puerto Rico was self-governing. And a lot of the statehood party also holds up as evidence of Puerto Rico not, being having more self-governance in some of the other territories. Okay.
So sort of Puerto Rico is not as colonized, according to the United States, as, let's say, Guam. That's interesting too. So I know that the United States has had a history of developing policies and programs to sterilize Puerto Rican women, and in some instances, even teenage girls. Can you tell us more about this history and its long-term impact? Why has the US been so invested in controlling reproduction in Puerto Rico? Why do they care? And what's been the consequence?
Yeah, well, it's definitely tied to the overall agenda of depopulation, the overall agenda like eugenics, science of people who are unfit to breed, and this concept that the Puerto Rico's unable to sustain such a large population. And so in the sterilization practices date back to the 30s. And there was a law that legalized sterilization in the 30s. And it was claimed to be because of overpopulation. This we see reflected in the economic attempts to develop the island. So Operation Bootstrap, there is in the 50s, and it's sort of this way to industrialize Puerto Rico. And I know it's separate from the sterilization, but it's all aimed at trying to make a Puerto Rico that's no longer has Puerto Ricans. So the sterilization, is happening at the time in state-sponsored hospitals. It's happening like sort of postpartum moments. It's billed to women as a reliable form of family planning. And during World War I, and so forth, like women were encouraged to enter the market, and particularly there was a lot of like needlepoint work happening. Like my great grandmother was part of groups of women who would do this at their home, and the sterilization kind of reaches its peak, and not in a year. I don't know what particular year, but overall the estimate is about 33% of the female population is sterilized through the 30s and the 70s. So about nearly 500,000 women, and it becomes known colloquially as just la operación. And one of my great grandmothers, was very clear that this was happening and talked to me about that. And there's a great documentary that I'll share the link with. It's available online for free, entitled La Operación. And it's, I think, actually one of the first films directed by a woman in Puerto Rico as well. And so, and I don't, I think the current iteration of these ideas, I think, just gets perpetuated. And what we see now is a high level of gender violence in Puerto Rico. And There's nearly one femicide a week occurring. And after the hurricane, women became twice as likely to be killed by intimate partners. And transgender women had over 200% increase in likelihood of being murdered in Puerto Rico. So there was a declaration of a state of emergency just last year made by the governor. And again, tying into how this is all rooted back in the political status is the Fiscal Control Board declined to approve the governor's request for funding to address the current gender violence issues. He requested like $7 million and they essentially said, oh, we'll approve about 200,000. So basically we're not going to support this. And there was massive response to this as a result of, like, at the moment there had been 2 intense killings of young women in their, I think, 20s. One was pregnant and one had attempted to, had contacted, had gone to court, seeking a restraining order, and none, they were not protected by this, by the state, and wound up, being their bodies being found. And it really rocked, I think. And that's what I think partly led to the state of emergency being declared. And over the last decade, there's a bit decline in the number of shelters in the island. So now I think there's about 9 for a population of over 3 million people. So there's very little access in the state of emergency, and this funding that was eventually approved by the Oversight Board is supposed to go towards K through 12 education, like infusing gender awareness throughout all the different classes and courses, but also services and some other tools. But feminist groups, there's a really strong group called the Colectiva Feminista, who've been on the forefront of this, which are kind of my generation of women, younger, and definitely supported by other collective feminist groups that are kind of shining a mirror back on the governor and really questioning, like, what do we don't see any results from your so-called state of emergency. Where is the urgency in which you should be responding to this, and acknowledging, sort of being accountable to the state being itself racist and sexist and homophobic, and how do we actually address this at top down and bottom up?
Yeah, I think that's a deep challenge when another nation is influencing or controlling so much of your political system. How do you even have elections, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you wind up with, a supposed Puerto Rican government that doesn't represent the people.
Right, and I think there's, since 1967, there's been 7 plebiscite votes, referendums, sort of opinion polls on the status. And it's been asked in different ways, what kind of future you want. And Congress has never, taken any of these referendums seriously. And so and they've slowly been, and so the 2 current bills in the Natural Resource Committee are trying to address the political status, and we're kind of in a moment where there's we're at a moment because of those 2 bills, and the chair of that committee is actually holding sessions, has held multiple sessions on the status on these 2 bills, and bringing in people to testify. I don't think we've ever seen as many U.S. politicians really being so open to talk about Puerto Rico status, hearing that, acknowledging that it's a colonial relationship, taking a position. So I think about 80 to 90 members of Congress have taken a position on one of these 2 bills. And that was part of our advocacy work, was reaching out to some of these offices and just educating them on the results, alternative voices, because the statehood party it's a business in Puerto Rico, and it's being pushed by lobbyists that pushed the Promesa bill in 2016, that very deep pockets tied to Wall Street, the Intercepted investigative report. But They're out here taking out ads in the LA Times and the Sacramento Bee and the New York Times, trying to lobby Biden to, I don't know, whatever he said when he was running about Puerto Rico, everyone says. But so we were trying to reach out, and a lot of these staffers of Congress members never get any education on Puerto Rico. They just don't have a basic foundation of what's going on or what people are saying. And sort of the statehood party represents a lot of very problematic cultural tropes and issues in Puerto Rico. So it's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Sounds beyond frustrating. Tell us a little bit, we have a little time left, and I would like to hear your insights about the presence of the US military in Puerto Rico. What are they doing, and how is the US military affecting Puerto Rico today and in the recent and longer past?
Well, super currently, after Maria, there was a huge presence there, and they were helping to distribute aid and provide, I think, some transition there. I don't know of a lot of current things going on, but the really important thing to talk about when it comes to the military is the sort of history of military, also experimentation. It wasn't just the medical experimentation, but the military used Puerto Rico to test a lot of chemical, like Agent Orange, in our sort of sacred land rainforest, which is probably the biggest watershed in Puerto Rico, sustaining half of maybe the island, and also in one of the smaller islands, Vieques, in the 40s was converted to a drill site, and for 60 years until 2003, Vieques was bombed heavily. And close to, I think, over 75% of this island, and there's it supported about 9,000 people. I'm not sure currently if it's still 9,000, but the military took over and just took over, whether you lived on people lost their houses and everything to be used for their own purposes. And they're in that island, in that one island, one of the results was like a threefold increase in cancer rates and many other respiratory issues and PTSD. And there was a massive protest, I think, in the early 2000s that led Bush to finally, and the Navy, essentially, these protests kicked out the US Navy from Vieques. And because of those bombs, though, there are thousands of them, the Navy was, supposed to be accountable to cleaning that up. And of course it's not. And these things are still seeping toxic chemicals into the water, into the beach, which actually spreads throughout the Caribbean, and have not cleaned up the beach in any urgent manner at all.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. So, speaking of the future, what do you hope? Would you like to see Puerto Rican independence? Would you like to see reparation? What does the future look like for Daring to Dream?
Well, I think one of the things I really want to point out is there's sort of an assumption that Puerto Ricans are unsure of what we want or what we think. Mm-hmm. And I want to be very clear that Puerto Ricans are absolutely, there's a coherent diagnostic that there's a colonial relationship here, and this is unsustainable and needs to go. And so there are people who support statehood for reasons, and then independence. And there's a bill, one of the bills is called the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, and that would allow for an educational campaign to explore the various options and what would Congress agree to, whether it is reparation, whether it is dual citizenship, depending on the direction it goes. And there are people who still want to maintain more or less the current status. And so I get worried about that divide and sort of pushing through one or the other without, knowing more thoroughly what would the transition or transformation look like. And I believe that Puerto Rico, like most of us, we have a cultural identity that's completely different than the United States. It's being part of the Caribbean. I'd like to see it have trading partnerships with its Caribbean neighbors, sort of its ancestral history of the indigenous Caribbean culture of Tainos. Like there was lots of movement in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. There's a lot of people in both places. I mean, a lot of Dominicans in Puerto Rico. And I'm very excited that this moment, there's been a resurgence of conversation on Puerto Rico, and I enjoy. I feel really hopeful that we can have these conversations and new topics are coming up. And just as like DC statehood is on the table, I want to point out that it's very problematic to conflate the two, being that Puerto Rico is a colonial territory, and the process. I hope to see a process of decolonization happen, but also for us to think about that it's the US that needs to decolonize and not Puerto Rico, because the US that is the empire. And so the US, is the concerns about Puerto Rico really been resolved? Like, is the issue of our cultural ethnic difference that identified or categorized Puerto Rico as an alien race, has that been resolved really? So that's why I hope we have more conversations about that. And there's the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in the SUNY schools, which are, I think, leading in this direction to create a working group to start thinking about and start discussing more what decolonization means and looks like.
You mentioned SUNY schools, meaning State University of New York.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
I don't know if it's still true, but I remember hearing a statistic a while back that there were more Puerto Ricans in New York City than there were in the island of Puerto Rico.
It is the biggest Puerto Rican municipality outside of Puerto Rico. And that goes back to the 50s and the 60s outward migration, where my grandparents left from fleeing poverty. And there's always been a strong history of independence movements in Puerto Rico. And dating back to the 50s, are heavily, where you're heavily, just heavily persecuted by the FBI, et cetera, and made it illegal to really participate in such activities. And people were imprisoned for decades. But I think independence is really it's a political, it's one of the political options that provides maybe one of the largest swath of tools and instruments for a country to develop economically, culturally, socially. And, I really want to see our culture continue.
So you would support Puerto Rican independence as compared to like statehood or something?
Right. Because I think statehood sort of culminates the invasion of 1898. And if there was a possibility to become, independence and then statehood after that, or a conversation, but I think Puerto Rico should be decolonized before it becomes, or offered become a state or impose statehood.
Makes perfect sense. For people who want to learn more, is there a book you would recommend?
Yes.
Starting place?
I have a couple here. There is a great historical fiction, a piece of historical called, The War Against All Puerto Ricans. And this is a great entry point to the sort of independence movement, the history of colonization and the connections. Like, for instance, the general that invades in 1898 is the same general who's in leading forces at Wounded Knee. And so this kind of gets into that those connections. And then more recently, after Hurricane Maria came out, there was this book, Aftershocks of Disaster. That's a collection of essays and poems produced by a couple of anthropologists called Yarimar Bonilla, Marisa Lebron. And then there's a couple of documentaries that I can share. One is The Last Colony, which is a few years, I think it was 2017 that it was released, but it's available for free online, as well as the one about the sterilization, history of sterilization that I'll share with you and can put in the chat.
That's really wonderful. And the first book you shared, The War Against All Puerto Ricans, who was the author?
That is Nelson A. Dennis.
Okay, great. So the War Against All Puerto Ricans and Aftershocks of Disaster. And the films were The Last Colony, and was there another one?
The Last Colony, the La Operación, and then there's one that an education that they have available for educational purposes. I mean, rental, I think, Huracan, Nation and Resistance. That's it's only a couple years old, and it's great. So that was one of the films we supported, a kind of statewide series of screenings in different colleges and community centers. And it's very well supported and received across the country by Puerto Ricans.
Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listening audience?
I hope I've made it just a few things clear about how Puerto Ricans feel, their status, that that we're very clear that this is not what we want. And I hope I made it clear that it's undeniably so, that Puerto Rico is a colony, just there's no doubting that. That's kind of my parting words. And I've put, our website on there, and so we have more information of our past and work and current bills and historical information as well. And yeah, there was a musical that came out about the uprisings in 2019 called Calle de la Resistencia that I'd share as well, and that gives a great insight. And another one, Landfall, silly me. There's this documentary called Landfall that premiered at Tribeca, and PBS POV picked it up nationwide as an excellent survey from Hurricane Maria till the last few years, and deals with the diaspora and issues locally. There's a huge cryptocurrency market and community in Puerto Rico that's really taken over large areas, and the gentrification as a result of sort of these tax incentives for corporations or crypto markets or revenues because of the tax exemptions that's occurring. And that's also really painful to see, because a lot of Puerto Ricans would love to buy, their family homes or go back and, set up shop, but it's really inflating housing, and it's creating, a lot of internal turmoil.
Thank you for sharing all of this. I'm so grateful that you were able to join us today, and really grateful as well for the work of Puerto Ricans in Action. Thank you so much for your time today, Nicole.
Yes, I appreciate it, Beth. It's so nice to be here with you. I look forward to the podcast to share with some friends as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Listening audience, I hope you'll join us next week, next Sunday, for our episode 28 on youth incarceration. And we're going to be joined by Edgar Ibarra, who's a survivor of youth incarceration, and by Dominique Nong from the Children's Defense Fund of California. So you can find that on our Eventbrite registration page, and for our Zoom audience, I'll put that link into the chat. And just want to thank all of you who are joining us live, and all of you who are listening later. Really grateful for everyone's investment in learning. Take care, everyone, and stay safe as you can.
Bye.
Bye. So